previous video, we saw how to set up a fairly standard, fully managed tenancy, one where the rent is applied by the system each month. You may also be dealing with let-only tenancies, where your agency acts to find a tenant and get the tenancy in place, but has no ongoing involvement after that. In this video, I'll set up a let-only tenancy and look at the key differences, particularly in terms of rent and security deposits. It's still important to specify the actual tenancy start and end dates, as this will highlight when they come to renewal time. Although you haven't been involved in the management during the year, it still presents a chance to pitch to the landlord for your management service for the incoming year. These tenancies will appear in the normal expiring tenancies report, but they will be highlighted as let only, so that's to avoid any confusion. To set up this tenancy, go to a vacant property and then click the Create Tenancy button. Fill in the tenancy dates and duration and then tick the Let Only checkbox. This will set the tenancy not to apply any rent by default. Now, it may be fairly common for the agent to collect the first month's rent. We'll create the tenancy here first and then come back and apply the first month's rent manually. Just leave the default to set up the rent later for now. If you're collecting a security deposit for the agent to pass on to the landlord, then don't specify a deposit here. There's a different way to do this in this case, which relieves you of any liability for the deposit, and we'll look at that in a moment. Basically, if you collect the security deposit from the tenant, then it's your responsibility to protect it, and the tenant could hold you responsible for it in future since they entrusted it to you in the first place. We would recommend that if you're collecting a deposit from the tenant, then you fulfill your obligation to the tenant and go the whole hog and protect it properly. To collect money from the tenant to pass on to the landlord for any reason, then you should use a recharge for this. Add a charge of type recharged expense due from the tenant to the landlord, and when the tenant pays it, this will appear on the property's credit balance to pay out to them. We'll look at that in a moment. Now that the tenancy is in place, let's come back to applying the first month's rent manually. There is no rent balance at the moment and there's no recurring rent schedule in place, and it highlights that to you. From the Rent and Charges menu, select Rent. This page typically shows the rent schedule and any rent which has already been applied and paid, but in this case we simply want to add rent. Untick the recurring checkbox and specify the date range to which that rent applies, so for example the first of the month to the end of the month, as well as the exact rent value. You don't need to specify a description here, it will just use the start and end dates automatically. Click Save and you'll then see this reflected in the rent balance. You'll also see this tenancy highlighted as let only as opposed to managed. We mentioned security deposits a moment ago, and I suggested treating this just in the standard deposit workflow due to the liability issues. If you wish to get money from a tenant to pass to the landlord directly though, for any reason, then this can be done as a recharge. It shouldn't be collected as rent, as that will first of all attract a percentage management fee, but it will also reflect as rent income for the landlord, which is incorrect from a HMRC tax perspective. So go to the Rent and Charges menu and click Charges, and then click Add Charge. You then want to charge the tenant, which is the default selection in this form. Choose a charge type of recharged expense due to the landlord, as opposed to the normal charges which are due to the agency. Untick the recurring checkbox, and then specify the value and an appropriate description, and then click Save. This will now show on the tenant balance, but it doesn't count as agency revenue and is treated completely separately from the rent. In upcoming videos we'll see how to record rent receipts from the tenant and how that rent is passed to the landlord and the property management fees are charged. There's also a dedicated video dealing with security deposits.